The old Apache couple stood at the edge of their land, watching dust devils dance across what was once fertile soil. Their children's departure had left only silence and memories. Wooden fence posts leaned like tired old men. The well coughed up more sand than water. Most would see only what was lost. A dying ranch, a family scattered to distant cities. But Nitan and Talutah saw differently. With calloused hands that remembered ancient ways, they began again. "We start where the spirits still speak," Nitan whispered, pressing the first seed into cracked earth. What happens when those who've been abandoned refuse to abandon hope themselves? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Miguel left was crisp with autumn's first breath. Nitan loaded the last cardboard box into his son's rusted pickup truck, his weathered hands lingering on the edge as if reluctant to let go. This was the fourth time he had helped a child leave, but the last departure cut deepest. "That's everything," Nitan said, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. Miguel nodded, jingling his keys nervously. At 26, he stood taller than his father now, though he carried himself with less certainty. "I'll call when I get to Albuquerque." Inside, Talutah moved silently through their small kitchen, wrapping a corn husk bundle with practiced hands. Her silver-streaked hair hung in a single braid down her back, moving like a pendulum as she worked. Inside the bundle, she placed dried sage, sweetgrass, a pinch of tobacco, and a small carved wooden horse, a protection medicine. "For your journey," she said, pressing it into Miguel's hand when he came to say goodbye. "And for after." Miguel's eyes flickered with something, guilt perhaps, before he pocketed the medicine bundle. "Ma, you know there's nothing here anymore. The land's played out." Talutah's expression remained impassive, but her dark eyes flashed. "The land remembers those who remember it." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the barn's weathered planks. The horse corral stood empty. They'd sold the last 3 horses last spring when the hay got too expensive. The chicken coop silent. No point keeping them when eggs sold so cheap at the supermarket 30 miles away. "You could come with me," Miguel offered, not for the first time. "There's senior apartments in the city. Government subsidized." Nitan shook his head. "This land has been in our family for 4 generations. My grandfather is buried beneath that cottonwood. And what? You'll be buried beside him after you both starve out here?" Miguel's voice rose, an old argument resurfacing. "Look around, Pop. There's nothing left." A pair of ravens watched from the fence post, their glossy eyes attentive. Talutah noticed them and straightened her shoulders. Ravens were messengers, witnesses. She would not show defeat before them. "We have everything we need," she said firmly. Miguel embraced them both, lingering longer than usual, as if some part of him recognized this departure was different from weekend visits to Phoenix or summer trips to see his sisters. "I'll be back for Thanksgiving," he promised, though they all knew November was far away and the construction job waiting in Albuquerque might not spare him. They stood together at the edge of the dusty drive, 3 figures growing smaller as the distance between them stretched. The truck disappeared around the bend, leaving only a fading dust cloud and the heavy silence of absence. That evening, Talutah found Nitan sitting on Miguel's bed, holding an old baseball glove. The room remained untouched. Posters from a decade ago still taped to the walls, a high school chemistry textbook gathering dust on the desk. Unlike their daughters who had packed everything when they left, Miguel had taken only what he needed for his new life, leaving behind the relics of his childhood as if preserving them in amber. "He thinks we're the past," Nitan said without looking up. "Something to be remembered, not lived with." Talutah sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "They have forgotten that new growth comes from old roots." Outside, the vast sky turned purple with dusk. The ranch house creaked and settled around them, suddenly too large for 2 people. 4 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, spaces once filled with voices, laughter, arguments, life, now echoing with absence. "Remember when this house felt too small?" Nitan asked, a rare smile lifting the corners of his mouth. Talutah nodded, remembering the chaos of raising 4 children in this modest home. The bathroom schedule conflicts, the dinner table battles, the whispered conversations late at night when they would finally have a moment alone. "Now listen," she said, gesturing to the silence. "Oh, we can hear ourselves think." Later they stood on the porch together, watching stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The ranch spread before them, once the center of their world, now a collection of weathered buildings and parched fields. "Tomorrow," Nitan said finally, "we will see what remains." Talutah took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "And what can be reborn?" A coyote called from the distant hills, its lonely voice carrying across the emptiness. Another answered, then another. A conversation in the darkness, speaking of hunger and hope and the long night ahead. Dawn broke harsh and unforgiving over the ranch. Nitan rose before the sun, a habit 40 years of ranching had etched into his bones. He made coffee in the stillness, the gurgle of the percolator unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Talutah joined him without a word, accepting the steaming mug with a nod. They drank in silence, watching light creep across the kitchen floor. The day ahead loomed large, time to face what remained. "The north pasture first," Nitan said finally, setting down his empty cup. They walked the property methodically, as if conducting an inventory of loss. The irrigation ditches lay cracked and empty, choked with tumbleweeds. Fence posts leaned at precarious angles, barbed wire sagging between them like tired old men, slouching against one another. The barn roof had sprung new leaks during the last monsoon season. At the edge of what was once their best grazing land, Talutah crouched to examine the soil, letting it sift through her fingers. "Too alkaline now," she murmured. "But not dead." Nitan nodded, squinting at the horizon. "The well's running lower each season. Maybe 15 feet of water left. Enough to start," Talutah replied. By midday, they'd circled back to the house. At the kitchen table, Nitan pulled out an old cigar box from the highest cupboard. Inside lay their financial life, bank statements, social security notices, medical bills, and a small leather pouch containing what remained of their savings. $738, he counted, arranging the bills in neat piles. Plus next month's social security. Talutah's face revealed nothing, but her fingers worked the edge of the tablecloth. "The property tax is due in November. We can make it," Nitan said, though uncertainty shadowed his voice. "If we're careful." Something caught Talutah's eye, a leather-bound book beneath the papers. "What's that?" Nitan hesitated before pulling it out. "My father's ledger. I'd almost forgotten." The book's spine cracked as he opened it, releasing the scent of old paper and faded ink. Inside, columns of neat figures marched across yellowed pages, recording decades of ranch life, cattle purchased and sold. Rainfall measured, crops planted and harvested. Talutah leaned closer, her finger tracing entries from long ago. "Look here, 1936, no rain for 76 days. Wells dropping. Sold East Herd to Wilcox for half value." Nitan turned the page. "Next entry, dug second well by hand. 27 feet to water. Enough to save the homestead." His voice softened. "He never told me about that." They pored over the ledger together as afternoon stretched into evening. Stories emerged from between the lines of careful accounting, years of drought followed by seasons of plenty. Cattle disease overcome, frost-damaged crops replanted. "They faced worse than this," Talutah observed, gesturing to an entry from the Dust Bowl years. "With less knowledge than we have." As darkness fell, they lit the kerosene lamp, reluctant to break the spell the old book had cast. Nitan turned to the final pages his father had written, dated just months before his death, 15 years ago. "Left the ranch to Nitan. 4th generation to work this land. May he pass it to his children stronger than he found it." The words hung in the air between them. Their children had no interest in this legacy. They'd made that clear with every departure. "James called the ranch a sentimental liability last Christmas," Nitan said, naming their eldest son. "Said we should sell to the developer who wants to build vacation homes." Talutah's jaw tightened. "This land doesn't belong to a developer. It doesn't even belong to us. We belong to it." From the kitchen drawer, she retrieved a notepad and pencil worn to a nub. "Now," she said, voice firm with resolve, "let's make our own ledger." Under the warm circle of lamplight, they began their accounting, not of what was lost, but what remained. Water rights, arable acres, seeds saved from better years, knowledge passed down through generations. Their own strong hands, slower now but skilled. "Miguel says we're living in the past," Nitan said, looking up from their list. Talutah shook her head, a smile touching the corners of her lips for the first time in days. "No, we're remembering the past to build a future." Outside, an owl called from the old cottonwood, its ancient voice speaking of patience, of darkness navigated by instinct and faith, of survival. Morning light streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the table where Talutah spread out a large sheet of butcher paper. She had found it tucked away in a drawer, saved from some long-ago birthday celebration. Now it would serve a different purpose. "We need to see it all at once," she explained, smoothing the crinkled edges with her palm. Nitan nodded, uncapping a felt marker with deliberate care. His hand hovered over the blank expanse. "Where do we begin?" "With water," Talutah said without hesitation. "Everything follows water." Nitan drew a blue line representing the seasonal creek that cut across their property, then marked the location of the struggling well. His hand moved with the confidence of someone who had walked this land for decades, every contour and feature committed to memory. "The old springs in the canyon might still be running," he said, marking an X near the eastern boundary. "My grandfather spoke of them." As the morning progressed, the paper transformed into a vision of possibility. They outlined areas for different plantings. Drought-resistant vegetables near the house where grey water could be diverted, native grasses in the far pasture, medicinal herbs in the sheltered area by the stone wall. The tribe's agricultural extension office might have heritage seeds, Talutah suggested, making a note in the margin. She had served on the seed-saving committee years ago, before their children's activities had consumed her free time. Nitan tapped the marker against the table, thinking. "Johnson over at the feed store mentioned permaculture last year. Said it works well in desert conditions. I'll need to learn more," Talutah said, writing the unfamiliar word carefully. "The library in town must have books." They worked through lunch, too engrossed to notice hunger. The map expanded to include timelines, resources needed, and tasks prioritized by season. Their experience as ranchers gave structure to their planning, but this was different from anything they'd done before. They weren't just trying to maintain, they were rebuilding from near collapse. In the afternoon, Talutah retrieved a small wooden box from her sewing room. It was carved from cedar, the lid inlaid with turquoise in a lightning pattern. Her grandmother had given it to her on her wedding day, and it had traveled with her from her parents' home to this ranch. "What's that for?" Nitan asked, looking up from his calculations of water needs. Talutah opened the box, revealing stacks of index cards covered in neat handwriting. "My mother's plant knowledge," and her mother's before her. She selected a card and read aloud, "Devil's Claw, plant with the waning moon. Seeds need scarification. Good for basket making and joint pain. Attracts pollinators for squash." She looked up at Nitan. "Knowledge we'll need." Nitan's weathered face softened. "You've kept these all these years." "Some things you don't discard," she replied simply. As they incorporated this generational wisdom into their plans, the scope of their undertaking became clearer. They were both in their 60s, Nitan 67, Talutah 63. Their bodies no longer recovered quickly from physical labor. Time was both ally and enemy. "We need to be realistic," Nitan said finally, rubbing his lower back where an old injury sometimes flared. "Some of this will take years." "Then it takes years," Talutah replied, her voice steady. "What else would we be doing?" The question hung in the air between them. Their children had repeatedly offered alternatives. Senior apartments in Phoenix near their daughters, a mobile home in Albuquerque close to Miguel, places where groceries and doctors were nearby, where air conditioning hummed through the summer heat, places where they would be visitors on someone else's land. "We need help," Nitan admitted, studying their ambitious plan. "More than just the two of us," Talutah nodded slowly. The Martinez boys might work for fair pay, and we can start small, just the house garden and one field this year. Evening approached, casting long shadows across their work. They had filled the butcher paper with a vision that was part memory, part dream, the ranch as it once was and as it could be again. More than a plan for the land, it was a map for the remaining years of their lives. Nitan carefully weighted the corners of their creation with smooth stones from the creek bed. "Tomorrow we begin," he said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had sustained their 43 years of marriage. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing the scent of rain from distant mountains. Not close enough to dampen the dusty earth, but a promise nonetheless. The first day of work began before sunrise. Nitan stood in the kitchen, filling 2 thermoses with coffee, his movements deliberate in the grey half-light. Talutah packed a small cooler with sandwiches and fruit, preparing for a long day outdoors. Few words passed between them. After 4 decades together, they operated with the synchronized efficiency of long practice. Outside, the air carried the mineral scent of desert morning, dust, sage, and the lingering coolness of night. Talutah paused at the edge of what would become their first garden plot, her breath visible in the chill. This area, closest to the house, had once been a vegetable garden when their children were young. Now it was hard-packed dirt, spotted with stubborn weeds. "We should bless the ground," she said. Nitan nodded, setting down his shovel. From her pocket, Talutah produced a small cloth bundle tied with sinew. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a mixture of herbs and tobacco. Kneeling, she offered pinches to the 4 directions, while Nitan stood respectfully silent. "We ask permission to disturb this earth," she murmured. "We promise to honor what grows here." The ritual complete, they began the physical work. Nitan drove the shovel into resistant soil, while Talutah followed with a garden rake, breaking apart clods and removing stones. Their bodies remembered these movements, even as aging joints protested. By mid-morning, they had cleared only a small section. Nitan straightened, pressing his hands to his lower back. "Harder than I remembered," he admitted. Talutah wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. "We've gotten older." "The earth hasn't." They rested in the shade of the porch, drinking water and surveying their modest progress. The task ahead seemed suddenly enormous, almost foolish for 2 aging people to attempt alone. "Miguel would say we're being stubborn." Nitan observed. "Miguel confuses stubbornness with perseverance," Talutah replied. After a brief rest, they returned to their labor. As the sun climbed higher, a pickup truck appeared on the dusty road. It slowed as it approached the ranch entrance, then turned in. Nitan recognized Ray Begay, who owned the neighboring property 5 miles down the road. They exchanged occasional greetings at the feed store, but weren't close. Ray stepped out, adjusting his straw hat. "Thought you folks would have packed up by now," he called, walking toward them. "Heard your boy left for the city. We're staying," Nitan said simply. Ray surveyed their work with barely concealed skepticism. "Planting season's almost over, and that ground looks mighty unforgiving. We're just preparing this year," Talutah explained, though she owed him no explanation. "For next spring's planting." Ray nodded slowly, hands in his pockets. "Well, don't work yourselves into the ground. Retirement's supposed to be about rest, isn't it?" After he left, a heaviness settled between them, the first external voice questioning their endeavor. They worked on in silence until midday heat forced them indoors. At the kitchen table, Talutah opened a worn leather satchel she'd retrieved from the back of their closet that morning. The leather was cracked with age, the beadwork along its edges faded. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had taught her to gather and save seeds during her childhood on the reservation. "Look what I found," she said, carefully emptying the contents onto the table. Small paper envelopes and cloth pouches spilled out, each labeled in her neat handwriting. Squash seeds from plants that had thrived during the worst drought year. Beans that had been cultivated by her family for generations. Chili peppers adapted to the region's temperature extremes. Corn varieties chosen for resilience rather than uniform appearance. "I'd forgotten about these," Nitan said, examining a packet labeled lightning corn, plant with summer rains. I save them every year, Talutah admitted. Even when we stopped planting the big garden, something wouldn't let me throw them away. Nitan opened one packet, pouring a few beans into his palm. They were speckled purple and white, smaller than commercial varieties. Will they still grow after all this time? Seeds can wait years for the right conditions, Talutah said. These have been waiting for us to be ready again. In the afternoon, they moved to the irrigation channels. Years of disuse had left them clogged and crumbling. Clearing them was painstaking work, shoveling out debris, reinforcing eroded sections, calculating gentle slopes to maximize the precious water they would carry. By sunset, their bodies ached in forgotten ways. Muscles long unused protested with every movement. Blisters formed on hands that had grown soft with lighter work. Yet as they watched the day's last light gild their modest accomplishments, something else overtook the discomfort, a sense of purpose neither had felt since their children left. Tomorrow, Nitan said, looking at the small section they had reclaimed from neglect. We'll do more. Talutah nodded, slipping her hand into his. Their palms pressed together, calloused, dirt-embedded, and alive with the day's efforts. Beginning again. The old pump groaned, a metallic protest that echoed across the morning stillness. Nitan stood by the well, frowning as the water sputtered and slowed to a thin trickle. After a week of steady progress preparing the soil, this development threatened everything. That doesn't sound right, he murmured. Shutting off the pump to prevent damage, Talutah approached, wiping soil from her hands. How bad? Bad enough. Nitan removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. We'd better call Martinez. By noon, Eduardo Martinez's truck kicked up dust on the approach to their ranch. The water specialist had served the county for 30 years, his expertise sought by every rancher for miles. Weathered by sun and wind like the landscape itself, Eduardo had known Nitan since they were young men. Heard your children all flew the coop, he said by way of greeting. Equipment clanking in the bed of his truck. News travels fast, Nitan replied dryly. Eduardo shrugged. Small county. He peered down into the well, listening to the echo as he dropped a small stone. Water tables dropping all over. This drought's got everyone worried. For the next hour, Eduardo conducted tests, measuring depth, checking water quality, assessing the pump's condition. Nitan and Talutah waited, tension building with each shake of the specialist's head. 15 feet of water left, Eduardo finally announced. Maybe less in the dry season. Pumps struggling because the water's silty. Too much sediment. He closed his notebook with a snap. You've got decisions to make. Inside, over coffee so strong it could hold a spoon upright, Eduardo laid out their options. None were good. Drilling deeper would cost thousands they didn't have. Water delivery was expensive and unsustainable. Conservation measures might extend what they had, but not indefinitely. Could pipe in from the creek, Nitan suggested. Eduardo shook his head. Creek's seasonal, and your water rights are limited. Wouldn't get you through summer. After Eduardo left, a heavy silence settled between them. The ranch had faced water issues before, but never this dire. Without reliable water, their entire restoration plan would wither before it began. Talutah stood at the kitchen window, gazing toward the canyon that marked their eastern boundary. Your grandfather spoke of springs, she said. In his stories, Nitan nodded slowly. He claimed there was a place where water always flowed, even in the worst droughts. Called it the Weeping Wall, he sighed. But that could be just an old man's tale. No one's looked for those springs in decades. Then perhaps it's time someone did. The next morning found them following a barely visible trail into the canyon. The path grew steeper as they progressed, loose rocks skittering beneath their boots. They moved carefully, conscious of their age and the dangers of isolated country. We should have done this years ago, Nitan admitted, pausing to catch his breath. When we were younger. We were busy raising children, Talutah reminded him. And there was more water then. By midday, they had explored several promising formations without success. Heat radiated from the stone walls, and their water bottles were half empty. Nitan checked his watch, concerned about the return journey. We should head back soon, he said. Talutah nodded, disappointment evident despite her stoic expression. As they turned to retrace their steps, a sound stopped them, faint but unmistakable in the desert silence. Water. Following the sound, they discovered a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. Nitan had to turn sideways to squeeze through, emerging into a small grotto hidden from the main passage. There, from a fracture in the rock face, water seeped steadily, collecting in a small pool before disappearing into the ground. "It's real," he whispered, reaching out to touch the wet stone. The weeping wall. Talutah knelt beside the pool, cupping her hands to taste the water. "Sweet," she declared, "and clear." For several minutes they sat in reverent silence, watching the steady drip that had continued through countless seasons of drought and plenty. Nitan's grandfather had not been spinning tales after all. From her pocket, Talutah produced a small copper ladle, worn smooth from years of use. It had been her mother's, used for ceremonial purposes, and carried today out of habit rather than expectation. She dipped it into the pool, capturing the pristine water. "For blessing," she explained, carefully preserving a small amount as they began planning aloud how to channel this discovery to their land. The journey back was energized by possibility. They mapped the most efficient route for pipes, calculated the water's flow rate, and debated storage options. It would be work, difficult work for two people their age, but not impossible. As the ranch came back into view, transformed by distance and evening light into something almost beautiful in its weathered dignity, Nitan paused. "Do you think we're being foolish?" he asked suddenly. "Trying to make this place live again at our age?" Talutah considered the question seriously. "Perhaps," she finally answered, "but foolishness and faith often look the same to others." She held up the copper ladle, catching the last sunlight. "This water has been waiting for someone to find it again, just as the land has been waiting." That night, they placed the ladle filled with spring water on their windowsill, where moonlight transformed it into silver, a promise of renewal, hidden until they were ready to discover it. The general store in Pine Creek served as the unofficial news hub for 3 counties. Talutah pushed her cart down the sparse aisles, gathering supplies, pipe fittings, seeds, and work gloves to replace Nitan's worn pair. She felt the sideways glances from other shoppers, heard the whispers that fell silent as she approached. At the register, Dottie Wilson rang up her purchases with deliberate slowness. A fixture in Pine Creek for 30 years, Dottie considered local gossip a civic responsibility. "Heard you folks are fixing up that old place instead of selling," she remarked, scanning a packet of nails. "After all your children moved away and everything." "That's right," Talutah replied evenly. "Mighty ambitious," Dottie continued, undeterred by Talutah's brevity. "At your age and all." The bell above the door jingled as Pastor Robert Collins entered. He spotted Talutah and approached with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission. "Mrs. Begay," he said warmly, "I've been hoping to catch you. How are you and Nitan doing out there all alone?" "We're managing," Talutah said, counting out cash for her purchases. "The church council discussed your situation at our meeting yesterday." The pastor's voice carried just far enough for nearby customers to hear. "We'd like to organize a work party to help with those repairs you're attempting." Talutah felt heat rise in her face, not from gratitude, but from the gentle condescension in his tone. As if their endeavor was a doomed but noble effort, worthy of charitable intervention. "Thank you, Pastor," she said carefully. "But we've got our own plans well in hand." Back at the ranch, Nitan was preparing the old tractor, a stubborn international harvester that had belonged to his father. He looked up as Talutah's truck approached, noting the tightness around her mouth as she stepped out. "Town was talkative today," she said, handing him a brown paper bag with his new gloves. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching thunderclouds build over distant mountains. Talutah recounted the conversations in town, the mixture of concern and skepticism that seemed to follow their decision to stay. "Pastor's organizing a work party," she concluded. "Said they discussed our situation at the church council meeting." Nitan snorted softly. "Our situation. Like we're charity cases. To be fair," Talutah said, "we are attempting something difficult, so we should just give up. Move to Phoenix, and visit our grandchildren on approved schedules? Nitan rarely showed anger, but it edged his voice now. Sit in an air-conditioned room watching television until we die? The following Sunday, a caravan of vehicles wound up their dusty drive, 3 pickup trucks and the pastor's sedan. Nitan and Talutah stood on the porch, watching as church members unloaded tools and a large cooler, brought lunch and willing hands. Pastor Collins called cheerfully, "Where do you need us?" For 4 hours the work party labored alongside them, clearing irrigation channels, reinforcing the barn's south wall, patching the coop roof. The help was genuine, if somewhat disorganized. Young men climbed ladders to clean gutters, while older church ladies planted flower beds along the house foundation. Children ran wild, exploring the outbuildings with delighted shrieks. Watching a teenage boy struggle with fence repairs, Nitan felt a pang for his absent sons. James would have known exactly how to set those posts. Miguel could have fixed the tractor in half the time it had taken Nitan last week. At noon, they gathered under the old cottonwood for a potluck lunch. Talutah contributed cornbread, made from the last of her blue cornmeal, wrapped in a faded dish towel she'd embroidered decades ago. The conversation flowed around them, local news, weather predictions, gentle inquiries about their children. "Have you considered one of those senior communities?" Mrs. Peterson asked between bites of potato salad. "My sister loves hers in Tucson. No maintenance, activities every day. We're happy here," Talutah replied. "But all this work," another woman chimed in. "And so isolated." Pastor Collins raised his hand, slightly quieting the group. "Let's remember why we're here today, to support our neighbors in the path they've chosen." He turned to Nitan. "Though, our door is always open if you need anything, or if your plans change." As the volunteers packed up to leave, Nitan noticed a young woman lingering by the newly cleared irrigation channel. She stood out among the church group, younger, with a quiet intensity as she examined the work they'd done. "You've used traditional methods here," she observed when Nitan approached. "My grandfather built channels like this on the reservation." "They work," Nitan replied simply. She nodded. "I'm Lisa Tsosi. I teach environmental science at the community college." She gestured toward the field they'd begun to prepare. "What you're doing here, it's important. Would you mind if I brought some of my students out sometime? We're studying traditional agriculture and water conservation." After the caravan departed, dust settling in their wake, the ranch seemed suddenly silent. Nitan and Talutah surveyed the day's accomplishments. More progress than they could have made alone in a week. "Help comes in unexpected forms," Talutah observed. "So does understanding," Nitan added, thinking of Lisa Tsosi's interest. He pulled the embroidered dish towel from his pocket, running his thumb over the intricate pattern Talutah had created so long ago. "This is beautiful," he said, though he'd seen it hundreds of times before. "Like everything you make." Talutah took the cloth, its threads faded but design still clear, a traditional pattern of rain clouds and corn plants, hope woven into everyday use. "Some things are worth preserving," she said simply. As evening approached, they returned to their work, alone again, but carrying the day's unexpected connections with them. The morning began like so many others. Coffee at dawn, quiet conversation about the day's tasks, the familiar rhythm of 2 people who had shared a life for decades. But Talutah sensed something different in the air, a subtle change she couldn't name. "I'll check the south field," she said, pouring the last of her coffee into a travel mug. The walk to the field took longer these days. Arthritis had settled into her knees, a dull companion that worsened in cold weather. But today she barely noticed the discomfort, her attention drawn to the section they had prepared and seeded 3 weeks earlier. She almost missed it at first, a whisper of green against dark soil, so faint it might have been a trick of the morning light. Kneeling carefully, Talutah bent closer to confirm what her heart already knew. There, pushing through the earth with quiet determination, was the first seedling. For several minutes she remained motionless, watching the fragile stem bend slightly in the breeze. How many thousands of plants had she grown over her lifetime? Yet this one, this improbable green finger reaching toward the sky, struck her with unexpected power. "Nitan!" she called, her voice carrying across the quiet ranch. "Come see." He appeared at the edge of the field, moving with the careful gait of a man who had worked hard all his life. When he reached her side, she pointed wordlessly at the tiny miracle. "Corn," he said softly, crouching beside her. "The lightning variety." More seedlings would follow, they knew. But this first one, the Scout, the Pioneer, carried special significance. Against drought, against their age and limitations, against their children's certainty that the ranch was finished. This small plant had emerged. "We should mark this day," Talutah said, from her garden apron. She withdrew a small camera, an old Polaroid that their daughter Sarah had left behind years ago. Talutah had found it while cleaning recently, surprisingly still functional with a few unused film squares. "Hold your hand beside it," she instructed Nitan. "For scale." The camera whirred and clicked, ejecting a grey square that slowly revealed the image. Nitan's weathered hand, fingers spread protectively near the delicate seedling, a visual record of beginning again. That afternoon, Lisa Tsosi arrived with 3 students, their university van raising dust on the approach. They carried notebooks and measuring equipment, faces bright with academic interest. "Hope we're not intruding," Lisa said. "My students are documenting traditional agricultural practices in the region." Nitan led the small group on a tour of their work, the irrigation channels designed to maximize scarce water, the companion planting borrowed from ancestors' wisdom, the rainwater catchment system they'd begun installing. One student, a young man with earnest questions and careful note-taking, lingered by the newly sprouted corn. "Why this variety?" he asked. "The yield must be lower than commercial corn." "It's not about maximum yield," Nitan explained. "It's about reliable yield, even in bad conditions. This corn has fed my family through 3 major droughts. Resilience over efficiency," the student murmured, writing something down. "Life isn't efficient," Nitan replied with unexpected sharpness. "It's persistent." After the students left, promising to return for more documentation, Talutah sat at the kitchen table, writing a letter to their children. She included the Polaroid photo, carefully attached with a small piece of tape. "Our first new plant," she wrote beneath it. "Your father says it has your grandfather's stubbornness." She described their progress in measured terms, neither exaggerating their success nor admitting how hard the work had been. She mentioned Lisa's interest in their methods, the church group's help with repairs, the hidden springs they'd rediscovered, a record of rebuilding offered without expectation. When the letter was sealed and addressed, copies for each of their 4 children, she placed them in the old mailbox at the end of their drive. Whether they would respond was uncertain. Their eldest daughter Sarah had written once. Their son James had called briefly on Nitan's birthday, but Miguel and Angela had maintained silence since leaving. That evening, they celebrated with a small ritual. Nitan built a fire in the pit near the house, and they sat watching flames dance against the gathering darkness. From a small wooden box, Talutah removed dried herbs and a pinch of cornmeal, offering them to the fire with whispered words of gratitude. "One seedling doesn't make a crop," Nitan said pragmatically. "No," Talutah agreed. "But without the first, there cannot be a second." Above them, stars emerged in a sky untainted by city lights. The same stars that had witnessed countless generations plant and harvest, suffer and celebrate on this land. Talutah found the familiar constellations, the 7 brothers, the basket, the mountain lion, teaching stories embedded in the night sky. "Do you think our grandchildren will ever know these stars?" she asked suddenly. "Or will they only see them through city haze?" Nitan had no answer, but the question lingered between them, giving deeper purpose to their work. They were preserving more than a ranch. They were maintaining a way of seeing the world, a relationship with land and sky that stretched back through generations. Later, Talutah carefully pressed the duplicate Polaroid between the pages of her journal, a small green promise captured in time. Their first victory, modest but undeniable. The radio crackled with static as Nitan adjusted the dial, searching for the weather report. Outside, clouds had been building all afternoon, heavy and dark, pressing down on the horizon. The crops were 6 weeks along now, their garden a tapestry of green against the desert landscape, unseasonable cold front moving through the region. The meteorologist's voice finally emerged clearly. Temperatures expected to drop into the low 30s overnight. Frost warnings in effect for elevations above 4,000 feet. Nitan and Talutah exchanged a look of alarm. A late frost could destroy everything they had nurtured. "We have maybe 3 hours before sunset," Nitan said, already moving toward the door. They worked with urgent efficiency, gathering supplies from the shed, old sheets, burlap sacks, the portable kerosene heaters they'd once used during winter power outages. Talutah filled metal buckets with water, while Nitan loaded their wheelbarrow with kindling and split logs. Like the spring of '92, Talutah recalled as they headed toward the fields. "Remember how we stayed up all night with smudge pots?" Nitan nodded. James was 10. He wanted to help so badly we let him stay up until midnight. The memory hung between them. 4 children huddled in jackets, helping to protect the family's livelihood, their breath visible in the cold night air. Now there were just 2 of them to do the work of 6. By dusk, they had covered the most vulnerable plants with sheets, positioned heaters at strategic points around the field, and prepared buckets of water along the perimeter. The water would release heat as it froze, potentially raising the temperature just enough to save their crops. She settled into her rocking chair and pulled out the quilt she'd been working on since spring. Half finished, it represented the ranch's revival. Squares of indigo, earth brown and green, arranged in a traditional pattern that spoke of balance and harmony. Some squares were elaborately stitched. Others remained blank canvas awaiting her attention. Like their life, the quilt existed in a middle state, neither beginning nor end, but process. Some days she added only a few stitches. Others, an entire section took shape beneath her nimble fingers. Tonight, she worked steadily, needle flashing in lamplight, adding a border of running water to frame the central design. A knock at the door interrupted her rhythm. Nitan entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea and something tucked under his arm. "Found this while cleaning out the tack room," he said, placing a dusty photo album beside her work. Together they paged through images of a younger version of themselves, building fence lines, branding cattle, standing proudly beside their first successful corn harvest. Their children appeared throughout the visual narrative, growing taller with each turning page, eventually vanishing as they left for college and careers. "We had a good life here," Nitan said simply. "We're still having it," Talutah corrected gently. "Just differently now." She returned to her quilting, adding stitches that would hold the layers together through years of use and washing. The needle dipped and rose in a rhythm ancient as heartbeat, creating permanence from fragments, crafting something that would outlast them both. "Do you ever regret staying?" Nitan asked suddenly. Talutah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she answered finally. "This is where we belong." She held up the half-finished quilt, a tangible metaphor. "It's not complete yet." Outside, a coyote called, a wavering note that hung in the darkness. Another answered from a different direction, neither close nor far, but somewhere in between, finding their own middle ground. The first students arrived just after 9, their cars raising dust clouds visible from the kitchen window. Lisa had called the previous evening to confirm 15 environmental science students for what she termed a field practicum in indigenous agricultural systems. Talutah watched them assemble in the yard, mostly young, mostly city-raised, clutching notebooks and water bottles, their faces open with curiosity. Among them stood 2 older men who didn't match the student profile. Tribal council representatives, Lisa explained during introductions. They're interested in documenting traditional methods for the cultural preservation program. Nitan nodded respectfully to the men. He recognized one, Ben Tahoma, who had served on the council for decades. The other, Mark Redhouse, was younger, but carried himself with the quiet authority of someone comfortable with responsibility. "We've heard good reports," Ben said, shaking Nitan's hand. Lisa says you're doing things the old way. Not entirely, Nitan admitted. We blend methods, whatever works. The morning unfolded in a structured tour, Nitan leading half the group through the water management systems, while Talutah showed the others their cultivation techniques. The students took photographs, measured soil moisture, collected samples, asked questions that ranged from practical to philosophical. Why plant in this pattern? A young woman asked, gesturing to the interplanted corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters, Talutah explained. Corn provides the pole, beans fix nitrogen in the soil, squash leaves shade the ground to retain moisture and prevent weeds. They help each other grow. Companion planting, the student noted, writing in her notebook. We called it that before there was a scientific term, Talutah said with gentle humor. It's knowledge that kept our people fed through difficult times. After lunch, sandwiches eaten in the shade of the cottonwood, Lisa gathered everyone for the day's main activity. Mr. and Mrs. Begay have agreed to demonstrate traditional seed saving techniques, she announced. This knowledge is increasingly rare and absolutely critical for agricultural resilience in our changing climate. Nitan disappeared into the barn, returning with a weathered chest. The wood was dark with age, its surface burnished by generations of handling. Iron hinges, hand-forged a century earlier, creaked as he opened the lid. My grandfather made this, he explained, removing carefully labeled cloth bags and glass jars. Every seed has a story. For the next hour, they demonstrated methods passed down through generations. How to select the strongest plants for seed production, proper harvesting time for maximum viability, gleaning techniques specific to each variety, storage methods that maintain germination rates across years of drought. The tribal council members paid particularly close attention, occasionally exchanging glances that communicated shared concern about vanishing knowledge. How did you learn these methods? Mark asked during a break. My father taught me, Nitan replied. And his father before him. He paused, something uncomfortable passing across his face. I tried to teach my sons, but they had other interests. Mark nodded, understanding. My children are the same. More interested in computers than corn. As the demonstration continued, Talutah noticed Ben wandering toward the house. She followed, finding him studying the old photographs on their living room wall. You have 4 children, he asked, indicating a family portrait. Yes, all grown now. None wanted to continue here? The question carried no judgment, only shared understanding of a common tribal experience. Younger generations moving away from traditional life ways. They saw more opportunity elsewhere, Talutah said simply. Ben nodded, then reached into his bag and withdrew a slender book bound in dark leather. This might interest you. The journal was old, its pages yellowed and covered in handwriting that alternated between English and Apache. Dates in the margins stretched back to 1898, with entries continuing to 1945. My great-grandfather's record, Ben explained. He documented agricultural practices, weather patterns, plant medicines. The council is creating an archive of such materials before they're lost. Talutah handled the book with reverence, recognizing its value beyond any monetary measure. Knowledge that had sustained people through unimaginable challenges, written down when oral tradition alone seemed insufficient insurance against cultural erosion. May I? She asked, gesturing to a particular page. Ben nodded. Please. The entry detailed a method for protecting seedlings from insect damage, using a solution of wild tobacco and juniper ash. Precisely the problem they'd been struggling with in their bean patch. We would like to include your knowledge in our archive, Ben said as she read. If you're willing to share it. Later, after the students departed with soil samples and data sheets, Lisa remained behind with the council members. They sat at the kitchen table while Talutah served coffee, the conversation turning to serious matters. The reservation's agricultural program is failing, Mark explained. Young people aren't interested in farming. Elders with knowledge are passing on. We're trying to reverse the trend. What you're doing here, Ben added. is exactly what we need to demonstrate that traditional methods can work in contemporary contexts. "We're just trying to survive," Nitan said modestly. "That's precisely the point," Lisa interjected. "Indigenous agricultural resilience has always been about adaptation and survival. Your blend of traditional knowledge and modern techniques is the middle path we're trying to document." As evening approached, a proposal emerged. The Tribal Council would provide modest funding for Nitan and Talutah to host workshops, teaching interested community members the methods they were employing. In exchange, their practices would be documented for the Cultural Preservation Archive. After the visitors left, Nitan and Talutah sat on the porch, watching sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. The journal Ben had shown them lay between them, a temporary loan containing potential solutions to challenges they hadn't yet encountered. "Strange," Nitan reflected. "We started this to save ourselves, not to become teachers." Talutah smiled, watching a hummingbird visit the sage blossoms near the steps. "Knowledge kept alive by using it is the most sacred possession we have." The bird hovered, suspended between earth and sky, wings moving too fast for human eyes to track. Like wisdom, invisible in its working mechanisms, but undeniably present in its effects, the first true harvest came as summer mellowed into autumn. Nitan and Talutah rose before dawn, the familiar ritual of coffee and quiet conversation serving as prelude to a day they had worked toward for months. "Ready?" Nitan asked, handing Talutah a light jacket against the morning chill. She nodded, something like excitement in her eyes, an expression he hadn't seen in years. They walked together to the fields, dew dampening their boots. The land had transformed under their care, irrigation channels running clear and purposeful, fences standing straight, crops arranged in patterns that honored both tradition and practicality. Nothing like the industrial farms their children had urged them to emulate, but productive in its own measured way. "We'll start with the corn," Talutah decided. They worked systematically, harvesting each variety at its peak. The heritage corn stood chest-high, modest compared to commercial hybrids, but bearing multicolored ears, resistant to the drought that had stressed neighboring farms. The three sisters' planting had thrived, beans and squash abundant among the corn stalks. By midday, they had filled their first harvest basket, not the overflowing bounty of their younger years when they'd fed a family of 6, but significant for just 2 people starting again. The basket itself was special, woven by Talutah during winter evenings from native grasses and reeds collected along the creek bed. "It's beautiful," Nitan said, running his hand over the intricate pattern. "The first basket is always special," Talutah replied. "It carries the season's hopes." They continued working through the afternoon, gathering chilies, tomatoes, and root vegetables from the kitchen garden. Every crop told a story of their perseverance. The potatoes that had survived late frost, the chilies strengthened by companion planting techniques gleaned from Ben's journal, the squash that had defeated persistent insects through traditional deterrents. As evening approached, they surveyed their harvest, modest but deeply satisfying. Most would be preserved for winter using methods Talutah's grandmother had taught her: drying, smoking, fermenting, storing in sand. Nothing wasted, everything purposeful. "We should share some," Talutah suggested. The following day, they packed small portions of their harvest into paper bags. Nitan drove while Talutah navigated, visiting neighbors who had shown kindness during their difficult beginnings. Ray Biguet accepted their offering with genuine appreciation. Eduardo Martinez exchanged their vegetables for fresh honey from his hives, and Pastor Collins invited them to the church harvest festival, an invitation they politely deferred. Their final stop was the Tribal Council office, where they presented Ben and Mark with specially selected seeds along with produce. "For the seed bank," Nitan explained, "and for your families." The men received these gifts with the proper ceremony such exchanges deserved, not mere thanks, but acknowledgement of a relationship strengthened through reciprocity. "The council has approved the workshop program," Ben informed them. First session in November, if that suits you. On the drive home, Nitan seemed preoccupied, hands tight on the steering wheel. What is it? Talutah asked. I was thinking about our children, he admitted. How they should be here for this. The statement hung between them, layered with complex emotions, pride in their accomplishment, sorrow at the absence of family to witness it, determination that had pushed them forward despite that absence. When they arrived home, the answering machine's red light blinked insistently. Nitan pressed the play button, surprised to hear their youngest daughter's voice. Mom, Dad, it's Angela. Sorry it's been so long. The recorded voice paused, background noise suggesting she was calling from somewhere public. I've been thinking I might visit next month, just for a weekend. Call me back when you can. They replayed the message twice, absorbing its significance. Angela, who had left most abruptly 5 years earlier, who rarely called, who had made her life in Seattle far from desert heat and family obligations. Should we call now? Nitan asked. Talutah shook her head. Let's wait until evening. She'll be at work. They spent the afternoon processing their harvest, hands busy with tasks that required minimal concentration, allowing their minds to circle around the unexpected development. By sunset, they had filled the pantry shelves with the first fruits of their labor, jars of salsa, bags of dried chilies, braids of corn hanging from the rafters. Finally, they placed the ceremonial first harvest basket on the kitchen table, a physical reminder of what they had accomplished. Talutah positioned it carefully, adjusting it several times until satisfied with its placement. For Angela's visit, she explained. So she can see. That evening they called their daughter, the conversation slightly awkward but warming as it progressed. They mentioned their harvest casually, not wanting to overwhelm her with details of the life she had rejected. She spoke of her job in graphic design, her small apartment, the persistent Seattle rain. I've been thinking about home lately, Angela admitted near the end of the call. About you two out there alone. We're doing well, Talutah assured her, catching Nitan's eye across the table. There will be much to show you when you visit. After hanging up, they sat in companionable silence. The prospect of Angela's visit had shifted something between them, a subtle rebalancing, like soil adjusting after rain. We should write to the others, Nitan suggested. Tell them about the harvest. Talutah nodded, already composing the letter in her mind. Not a plea for recognition or an invitation laden with expectation, but a simple sharing of news. The land is healing. We are well. There is food in the pantry and seeds for next year's planting. Outside, darkness gathered around their small home, the desert cooling rapidly after sunset. But inside, surrounded by the tangible results of their labors, a different warmth prevailed. The quiet satisfaction of those who have persevered and found themselves changed by the journey. The guest room hadn't been used in years. Talutah stripped the bed, washing sheets that smelled of disuse despite her careful storage. She swept cobwebs from corners, dusted the dresser where Angela's childhood trophies still stood, debate team, science fair, a small ceramic horse from her 4-H days. Should we move these? Nitan asked, gesturing to the mementos. Talutah considered the question. No, let her see we've kept them. Preparation for Angela's visit consumed them. Nitan repaired the loose step on the porch, changed the light bulb in the bedside lamp, made sure the hot water heater worked properly. Talutah planned meals featuring their harvest, baked Angela's favorite pignon cookies, arranged wildflowers in a pottery vase for the bedside table. 2 days before the scheduled visit, Nitan drove to town for supplies. At the general store, he encountered Ray Begay studying the bulletin board. Heard your daughter's coming home, Ray remarked. News still traveled with preternatural speed in their small community. Just for the weekend, Nitan clarified, not wanting to invite too much curiosity. My son visited last month, Ray continued. First time in 3 years. Barely recognized the place. He chuckled, though the sound carried little humor. Said it was too quiet. Left a day early. Nitan nodded noncommittally, uncomfortable with the parallel. At the gift shop, he lingered over a display of local handicrafts. Angela's birthday was the following week. Eventually, he selected a small silver pendant, a Thunderbird design crafted by a Navajo artisan from the reservation. The shopkeeper wrapped it in tissue paper and placed it in a tiny blue box with a ribbon, someone special. She asked with a smile. "My youngest daughter," Nitan replied, surprising himself with the pride that warmed his voice. Back at the ranch, Talutah was hanging fresh curtains in Angela's room. She'd sewn them herself, using fabric left over from her quilting projects, a southwest pattern in colors that complemented the desert landscape outside the window. "Found this," she said, showing Nitan a photograph she'd discovered while cleaning. 10-year-old Angela on horseback, her smile revealing missing front teeth, Nitan standing beside her with his hand on the saddle. Her first time riding alone, he remembered. She was so determined not to show fear. The day before Angela's arrival, they made final preparations. Talutah prepared traditional foods: blue corn mush, chilies stuffed with cheese and herbs from their garden, honey from Eduardo's bees. Nitan swept the yard, arranged chairs on the porch for evening conversations, prepared a small bonfire pit for stargazing, as they had done when the children were young. "Not too much," Talutah cautioned gently. "She's only staying 2 nights. The telephone rang as they finished dinner. Talutah answered, her face shifting subtly as she listened. Nitan watched, already knowing before she handed him the receiver. "Dad?" Angela's voice sounded distant, overlaid with airport announcements in the background. "I'm so sorry, but I have to cancel my visit." The explanation came in a rush of words: a last-minute work assignment, an important client, a career opportunity she couldn't refuse. Behind the professional justifications, Nitan detected something else: hesitation. "Perhaps even relief, we understand," he said, though he didn't. "Work is important. I'll reschedule soon," Angela promised. "Maybe at Christmas." After hanging up, Nitan relayed the conversation to Talutah, who received the news with a composure that spoke of practiced disappointment. "We should put the food away," she said practically. "Most will keep." They worked in silence, wrapping dishes intended for tomorrow's welcome lunch, returning ingredients to shelves, adjusting to the sudden absence of purpose that had driven them all week. When the kitchen was set to rights, Talutah disappeared into their bedroom without explanation. Nitan remained at the table, turning the small gift box in his hands. The ribbon had been slightly crushed during the drive home, and he attempted to reshape it, his large fingers clumsy with the delicate task. Finally, he placed the box in the carved cedar chest where they kept important papers and mementos, burying it beneath insurance documents and their children's graduation programs. Later, unable to sleep, he found Talutah sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill. He settled beside her, the familiar rhythm of their breathing synchronizing as it had for decades. "I remember when this house was too full," she said finally. 4 children, always noise, never enough hot water, privacy a forgotten concept." Nitan nodded, recalling the controlled chaos of those years, the bathroom schedule posted on the door, the refrigerator emptied by teenage appetites, the constant negotiations over vehicle use and curfews. "We complain when they're underfoot," Talutah continued, "then miss them when they're gone." The night deepened around them. Desert silence broken only by the distant call of coyotes. Above, stars wheeled in patterns unchanged since their ancestors first recognized them, constant despite earthly disappointments. Eventually, they returned inside. Passing Angela's prepared room, Nitan noticed the carefully wrapped package on the dresser, a birthday gift for their youngest granddaughter Emma, whom they had met only twice. The colorful paper featured cartoon princesses, selected during a special trip to town, the card signed with careful messages from both grandparents, another gift that would remain undelivered. "At least for now. Should I put it away?" he asked. Talutah shook her head. "Leave it. She'll come eventually." The certainty in her voice gave him pause, not blind hope or denial, but the patient perspective of a woman who had witnessed many seasons of growth and dormancy, who understood that some seeds germinate only after long periods of waiting. In the morning, they returned to their routines, irrigation checks, chicken feeding, garden maintenance. The disappointment remained, a shadow presence accompanying their movements, but it did not define them. The land demanded attention regardless of human emotional tides. And in this they found steadying purpose. "We'll call Miguel tonight," Talutah decided, as they worked side by side replanting a section of herb garden. "Just to check in." Nitan nodded, recognizing her unstated strategy, maintaining connections despite setbacks, refusing to let disappointment harden into resentment. The work of nurturing family, like nurturing land, required persistence through failures and faith in eventual harvests. The workshop had been Ben Tahoma's idea, a series of Saturday sessions teaching traditional agricultural methods to anyone interested. Nitan had agreed reluctantly, uncomfortable with the role of teacher, doubtful that anyone would attend. "People are curious," Ben had assured him, "and hungry for this knowledge." Now, as Nitan arranged chairs in a semicircle beside their demonstration garden, he wondered if Ben's confidence had been misplaced. The sky threatened rain, unusual for the season but welcome for the land, and few would drive the dusty road to their remote ranch in such weather. "How many chairs?" He called to Talutah, who was arranging sample plants on a folding table. Ben said 12 confirmed. She replied, "Maybe half will come." They had prepared carefully, handouts printed at the tribal office, plant specimens labeled, areas of the ranch designated for hands-on demonstration. Still, Nitan harbored doubts about his ability to communicate knowledge that lived in his hands more than his words. At 9:30, headlights appeared on the approach road. Not one vehicle but a caravan, Ben's truck leading 3 cars, and a van bearing the Tribal Council logo. Nitan and Talutah exchanged surprised glances as people began emerging. Not 6 participants, but 15. Ben approached with a wide smile. "Told you there was interest." The group assembled under the canvas canopy they had erected that morning, a mix of ages and backgrounds Nitan hadn't anticipated. Several elders from the reservation, a young couple who introduced themselves as organic farmers, 3 of Lisa's students, a middle-aged man who identified himself as a county extension agent, and surprisingly, Ray Begay. "Didn't know you were interested in this sort of thing," Nitan remarked as his neighbor settled into a chair. Ray shrugged. "Drought's hitting everyone. Figured it couldn't hurt to learn some old tricks." The session began awkwardly, Nitan stumbling through his introduction, until Talutah gently guided the conversation toward practical demonstrations. As they moved through the garden, showing water conservation techniques and companion planting methods, his discomfort gradually eased. These weren't abstract concepts to be lectured on, but lived practices embedded in his daily movements. "See how the irrigation channel follows the natural contour," he explained, pointing to the subtle slope they had incorporated. "Water wants to find its own path. Our job is to work with that tendency, not against it." Questions came, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as participants recognized his genuine knowledge. Even Ray, initially skeptical, began taking notes as Nitan demonstrated how their modified ollas, unglazed clay pots buried near plant roots, reduced water usage by nearly 60% during lunch, a communal affair with participants, contributing dishes that created an impromptu feast. Ray approached Nitan privately. "That system you built from the canyon spring," he said, keeping his voice low. "Could something similar work on my southeast section?" "Possibly," Nitan allowed. "Depends on the grade and soil composition. Could you take a look sometime?" The request clearly cost Ray some pride. Been losing that section to drought 3 years running. By afternoon, rain clouds had gathered in earnest. They moved the workshop into the barn, where Talutah led a session on seed saving. As thunder rolled across the desert, participants huddled around tables sorting and packaging seeds, while she explained storage methods and germination techniques. "Each seed carries a story," she told them, echoing words her grandmother had spoken decades earlier. When you save seed, you're preserving not just a plant, but a history. The workshop concluded as rain began falling in earnest. Gentle, soaking precipitation that seemed to validate the day's teachings. Participants hurried to their vehicles with promises to return for the next session, many lingering to ask final questions despite the weather after the last car disappeared down the road. Nitan and Talutah stood on the porch, watching rain transform their land, deepening colors, releasing the scent of wet earth, bringing immediate life to every surface. 16 people, Talutah marveled. Ben was right, for now, Nitan cautioned. Let's see how many return next month. The following morning dawned clear, the landscape refreshed by overnight rain. Nitan rose early to assess any damage to the fields, finding instead the expected blessings of natural irrigation. As he walked the property's edge, something caught his eye. A figure approaching on foot from the direction of Ray's ranch. Ray carried a long object wrapped in cloth. He raised his hand in greeting as he drew closer. "Brought something," he said without preamble. "My grandfather made it." Unwrapping the cloth revealed a hand-carved wooden staff, its surface darkened by decades of use and handling. Intricate patterns spiraled along its length, interrupted by notches that formed a measuring system of some kind. "Planting staff," Ray explained. He used it to gauge seed depth and spacing. "Marks are calibrated for different crops." He cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the gesture's significance. "Thought it might interest you folks, with your teaching and all." Nitan accepted the offering with appropriate ceremony. Recognizing it as more than a functional tool, it was an acknowledgement, a restoration of connection between neighbors and land-based knowledge. "We would be honored to use it in our demonstrations," he said formally, "and to learn its specific wisdom." The exchange marked a subtle shift in their community standing. Over the following weeks, other visits occurred. The county extension agent returning to document their water conservation system, the young farming couple seeking advice about pest management without chemicals, a tribal elder bringing his grandchildren to help plant a section of heritage corn. Most surprising was the article in the local newspaper, a feature on traditional farming, revival, that prominently mentioned their ranch and workshops. The piece included quotes from Lisa about agricultural resilience and climate adaptation, alongside a photograph of Nitan demonstrating irrigation techniques. "You're becoming local celebrities," Lisa teased during her next visit. "Bringing a copy of the paper, not celebrities," Talutah corrected gently. "Just people who remembered what others forgot." That evening they sat together reviewing notes for the next workshop. The planting staff Ray had gifted them rested against the wall, a tangible symbol of knowledge transmitted across generations. Nearly lost but reclaimed through persistence and necessity. "It's strange," Nitan reflected. "We started this to save ourselves, but now it's growing beyond us," Talutah finished, understanding as she always did. Like any good planting, 2 years had passed since they began. The calendar marked the anniversary with no special notation, just another square in the continuous flow of days. But Nitan and Talutah recognized the milestone in the land itself, in the transformation visible from every vantage point. "Remember how it looked before?" Talutah asked, as they stood on the rise overlooking their property. The question needed no specific reference. They both carried the before image in their minds, a comparison point that made the present view all the more remarkable. Where dust and sparse vegetation had dominated, now grew a tapestry of deliberate abundance. The irrigation channels, hand-dug and stone-lined, created veins of moisture through formerly parched fields. Crops grew in patterns that maximized limited resources, traditional plantings interspersed with experimental plots suggested by Lisa's students. The old barn stood straight-backed again, its roof no longer sagging, its purpose restored as a teaching space and storage facility for their increasing harvests. But most surprising were the unexpected changes. The volunteers that had appeared without human planting. Wildflowers colonized the field margins, their seeds carried by wind or birds from distant sources. Native grasses reclaimed areas where erosion had once ruled. A family of cottontail rabbits had established residence beneath the toolshed, their presence both agricultural nuisance and welcome sign of returning ecological balance. "The land remembers itself," Talutah observed. That afternoon, Eduardo Martinez visited to check a regular maintenance call that had become more social than professional over time. "Water tables rising," he reported, with pleased surprise after completing his measurements. "Up almost 3 feet since last year." "The spring feed is helping," Nitan suggested. Eduardo shook his head. "It's more than that. Your water management is actually regenerating the aquifer beneath your property. The clay-lined retention basins, the swales capturing rainwater, it's all working together." As Eduardo's truck disappeared down the drive, Talutah retrieved the small digital camera Sarah had sent for their anniversary, a gift accompanied by a note recognizing their accomplishment. To document your miracle, they had been slow to adopt the unfamiliar technology, preferring Talutah's old Polaroid with its immediate, tangible results. But lately, they had begun using the digital camera more frequently, amassing visual evidence of their progress. "We should take new pictures," Talutah suggested. For comparison, they spent the remainder of the day photographing the ranch from established vantage points, the same angles they had captured when beginning their restoration. The before and after contrast was startling even to them who had witnessed the change incrementally. Where the earlier images showed barren fields and dilapidated structures, the new photographs revealed vibrant plantings, rehabilitated buildings, and most significantly, a landscape that appeared to be breathing again. The phone rang as they reviewed the images on the camera's small screen. James's number appeared on the caller ID. "Have you seen the newspaper?" he asked without preamble when Nitan answered. "Which newspaper?" Nitan felt a familiar tension at his eldest son's tone, always slightly rushed, as if their conversations were squeezed between more important matters. "The Republic. There's an article about sustainable agriculture featuring your ranch. They're calling it a desert miracle. Lisa emailed it to me. The article, it transpired, had been written following the regional agricultural conference, where Lisa had presented a case study of their restoration methods. The piece highlighted their blend of traditional knowledge and contemporary techniques, positioning their ranch as a model for climate resilience in arid environments. "They make it sound like you're running some kind of research station," James said, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and something harder to identify. Pride, perhaps, or regret. After the call, they drove to town to purchase copies of the newspaper. The general store had sold out, the proprietor informed them with a knowing smile. "Got a lot of attention, that article. Put you folks on the map?" At the diner, they found themselves approached by strangers who recognized them from the newspaper photograph. Mostly polite curiosity. A few genuine questions about their methods. The attention was uncomfortable, but not unwelcome, a validation of sorts. Back home, they found a message from Miguel on their answering machine. "Saw the article about the ranch," his recorded voice reported. "Impressive. Some guys at work were talking about it. Didn't realize those were my parents until I saw the photo. Call when you get a chance." Later, they sat on the porch as evening approached, the digital camera between them on the small table. The day's developments had left them slightly disoriented, their private endeavor suddenly rendered public, their personal restoration unexpectedly reframed as noteworthy achievement. "Should we send the photos to the children?" Nitan asked. Talutah considered the question. "Yes," she decided. "It's time they saw." That night she composed emails to each of their 4 children, her typing slow and deliberate on the laptop computer Lisa had helped them purchase for workshop preparations. To each message, she attached the same series of photographs, the barren before images juxtaposed with the thriving after shots taken that day. No commentary accompanied the visual evidence, no request for response or validation. Just silent testimony to what persistence could accomplish. The replies began arriving the next morning, first from Sarah, always quickest to respond, then James with characteristic brevity, Angela with warm surprise, and finally Miguel, whose message was shortest but most significant. Planning to visit next month if that works for you. Want to see it in person? As Nitan read the messages aloud, Talutah listened with measured emotion. Not overjoyed, not vindicated, but quietly satisfied that the visual story had spoken what their words could not. "The land tells its own truth," she said simply. Outside their window, a hummingbird hovered at the native sage they had planted, a flash of iridescence against desert tones. Another returnee to the recovering ecosystem, drawn by renewed abundance. Like their children, perhaps, beginning to recognize that something remarkable had taken root in the place they had abandoned as hopeless. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, its businesslike tone masking the emotional weight of its contents. "Dear Mom and Dad, after discussing among ourselves, we've decided to coordinate visits. Miguel suggested we all come together next month, rather than staggering our trips. Sarah can only get away for the weekend, but James and I can stay through Monday. Angela will drive down from Seattle. Does this work for you?" "James," Nitan read the message twice, absorbing its implications. "All four of them," he said finally. "Together." Talutah nodded, her hands perfectly still on the kitchen table. It's been 7 years since that happened. The last occasion had been Nitan's 65th birthday, an awkward gathering marked by tense conversations about the ranch's future, their children's unified suggestion that they sell the property and move somewhere more manageable. The weekend had ended with strained goodbyes, and Miguel's departure 6 weeks later, the last of their children to leave. Now they were returning, not individually but as a unit. Their coordinated visit carrying an unspoken significance that both Nitan and Talutah recognized. "We should prepare," Talutah said simply. Preparation became their focus over the following weeks. Beyond the expected cleaning and organizing, they approached the visit with the careful strategy of diplomats preparing for crucial negotiations. The ranch needed to speak for itself, not as justification for their choices, but as living testament to what they had accomplished. They intensified their work schedule, rising earlier and working later to ensure every aspect of the property reflected their vision realized. Irrigation channels were cleared of any debris, garden beds weeded and mulched, buildings swept, and minor repairs completed. The bounty of their harvest was preserved in visible abundance, jars of vegetables lining pantry shelves, dried herbs hanging from kitchen rafters, root cellar organized with mathematical precision. "Are we overdoing this?" Nitan asked one evening, rubbing his lower back after a long day, reinforcing the chicken coop roof. "Not for ourselves," Talutah replied, her meaning clear. This preparation wasn't performance, but personal affirmation, regardless of their children's reactions. The ranch would stand as their accomplished truth. 3 days before the visit, Nitan disappeared into his workshop after dinner. The small outbuilding had once been a storage shed before he had claimed it as his domain, a place for woodworking and solitary projects. He emerged near midnight, carrying something wrapped in a drop cloth. "For the entrance," he explained, unveiling a hand-carved wooden sign. The words "Begay Ranch" stood in relief against a background of mountains and corn plants. The entire piece sealed against weather with clear varnish. "It's beautiful," Talutah said, running her fingers over the carved surface. The following day, they installed the sign at the entrance to their drive, a modest declaration of identity and permanence. Standing back to assess its placement, Talutah felt a subtle shift in her understanding of their journey. What had begun as resistance against ending had transformed into something entirely new, not mere continuation, but regeneration. The morning of their children's arrival dawned clear and cool, autumn light casting long shadows across the ranch. Nitan and Talutah moved through final preparations with the practiced coordination of their long partnership. Fresh towels in bathrooms, Coffee prepared for brewing, subtle adjustments to already impeccable arrangements. At precisely 11, the first vehicle appeared on the approach road, Sarah's silver SUV, followed closely by James's luxury sedan. Minutes later, Miguel's truck arrived, dust billowing behind it. Last came Angela's compact car, its Seattle license plate a reminder of the distance traveled. Nitan and Talutah stood on the porch, watching their children emerge and greet each other with hugs and exclamations before turning toward the house. The peculiar alchemy of family was immediately apparent. Adult individuals transforming back into siblings, old dynamics resurfacing in gestures and tones despite the passage of years. "They've barely looked at the ranch," Nitan murmured. "They will," Talutah assured him. The initial greetings passed in a blur of embraces and overlapping conversations. Their children moved differently now. Sarah more confident, James slightly heavier, Miguel's hair starting to grey, Angela's city pallor contrasting with her siblings' complexions. Yet beneath these changes, Talutah recognized the essential qualities that had defined them from childhood. Sarah's caregiving instincts, James's analytical observations, Miguel's restless energy, Angela's artistic sensitivity. As luggage was carried to bedrooms and initial pleasantries exchanged, Talutah noticed their children's sideways glances at the transformed interior. The walls repainted, the furniture rearranged for better flow, the subtle incorporation of new textiles she had woven alongside familiar family pieces. "The house looks different," Sarah commented, her tone carefully neutral. "We've had time to think about what works best," Talutah replied. Lunch was served on the porch, a deliberate choice that placed the ranch's transformation in full view. As they ate, food grown entirely on their property, conversation initially clung to safe topics, jobs, weather, brief mentions of extended family. But gradually, their children's attention turned to the obvious changes in the landscape before them. "Those fields were bare when I left," Miguel said finally, gesturing toward the thriving crops visible from their vantage point. "And the barn roof actually looks straight. There's so much green," Angela added, her designer's eye clearly registering the controlled abundance that had replaced barren expanses. "We've been busy," Nitan said simply. After lunch, he suggested a tour. Their children exchanged glances with an unspoken communication that parents recognized but couldn't access, then nodded in agreement. As Nitan led them along carefully maintained paths, explaining irrigation systems and planting methods, Talutah watched their reactions, initial politeness gradually giving way to genuine interest and, in moments, unmistakable admiration. The newspaper article didn't do it justice, James admitted, as they viewed the rehabilitated spring catchment system. "This is engineering." "It's more than that," Sarah corrected, her gaze taking in the integrated design of water, plants, and structure. "It's like you've created an entirely new place from what was dying." By sunset, the tenor of the visit had shifted. Their children moved differently through the space, not as critical outsiders, but as reconnecting participants, asking questions that revealed growing engagement. At dinner, conversation flowed more naturally, childhood memories surfacing alongside new observations. The present and past beginning to reconcile. Later, as darkness settled around them, they gathered at the fire pit Nitan had prepared. Miguel produced a bottle of whiskey from his truck, pouring small measures into coffee mugs. In the firelight, family resemblances became more pronounced. The same cheekbones and brow lines repeated across generations. Genetic echoes binding them beyond choice or circumstance. "To the new Begay Ranch," Miguel proposed, raising his mug, "and to the most stubborn parents in 3 counties." The toast contained both acknowledgement and apology, offered and received in the indirect communication style that characterized their family. As they drank, Talutah felt something long knotted begin to loosen, not complete resolution, but the beginning of a new understanding. Above them, stars emerged in patterns their ancestors had used for navigation through countless seasons of loss and renewal, constant yet ever-changing, like family itself. Morning revealed the ranch in gentle clarity, dew-dampened fields catching early light, chickens clucking as they began their daily scratching. The rhythms of the place continuing regardless of human emotional tides. Nitan rose at his usual hour, moving quietly through the kitchen to avoid waking their children who still slept in bedrooms long empty. Coffee brewed. He stepped onto the porch and found James already there. Laptop open despite the early hour. Never could sleep past sunrise out here, James remarked, closing his computer. Too quiet compared to Phoenix, Nitan handed him a mug. Your body remembers. They sat in companionable silence until James spoke again. You've created something remarkable here, Dad. The admission seemed difficult, pressed past some internal resistance. When we left, I thought that we were being foolish, Nitan finished for him. Holding on to something dying? James nodded, studying the steam rising from his coffee. I was wrong. Inside the house, others were stirring. Sarah emerged first, then Angela, both automatically moving toward kitchen tasks as if reverting to childhood patterns. Miguel appeared last, hair tousled from sleep, immediately heading for the coffee pot. Breakfast unfolded with surprising ease, conversation flowing naturally as they reoccupied familiar roles around the table. Talutah watched her children's interactions with quiet attention, noting how they unconsciously mirrored gestures and expressions despite years of separation. Family resemblance went beyond physical features. It lived in the tilt of a head while listening, the particular way hands moved when making a point, the shared humor that required no explanation. After breakfast, Sarah discovered the cabinet where Talutah kept family photographs. Among them was a portrait taken 5 years earlier, the last time all 6 of them had been together. Sarah brought it to the table, placing it beside her phone, where she had just captured a similar image of the current gathering. Look at the difference, she said. The contrast was striking. In the older photograph, tension was visible in their postures, Nitan and Talutah appearing slightly diminished against the backdrop of their children's confident stances. In the new image, this dynamic had subtly reversed. Their parents stood straight-backed and grounded, emanating a quiet strength that altered the family's visual geometry. You both look younger now than you did then, Angela observed, surprise evident in her voice. Purpose does that, Talutah replied simply. As morning progressed toward afternoon, the conversation gradually shifted from safe topics to deeper waters. Seated in the living room, family photographs spread across the coffee table between them. They approached the unspoken questions that had shadowed their reunion. Why didn't you come visit us? Sarah asked finally, her directness characteristic of her role as eldest. Any of us. We all invited you. The ranch needed us, Nitan answered, more than your grandchildren needed to know you. The question carried years of accumulated hurt. That's not fair, Sarah, Miguel interjected. We're the ones who left, because there was nothing here. Sarah's voice rose slightly. The ranch was failing. You were getting older. It made sense for you to retire somewhere with services, community, family nearby. This is our community, Talutah said quietly. This land is our family too. James leaned forward, assuming the mediator role he'd occupied since childhood. What Sarah means is that we worried about you out here alone. Still do. We're not alone, Nitan replied, gesturing toward the window where the revitalized landscape offered silent testimony. And we're not merely surviving. We're building something that matters. Angela, who had remained largely silent, spoke unexpectedly. I think I understand now. Her artist's sensibility had always made her most attuned to unspoken meanings. This isn't about stubbornness or being unable to let go. It's about creation, isn't it? Making something new from what was broken. The observation hung in the air, a moment of clarity that shifted the conversation's temperature. Miguel stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to the family as he composed his thoughts. I feel like I abandoned you, he admitted finally, turning to face them. Not just physically left, but wrote you off. Decided your way of life was finished. His voice caught slightly. I'm sorry for that. The apology opened a door that others followed through. Sarah acknowledged her controlling tendencies disguised as concern. James confessed to dismissing their parents' choices while being secretly impressed by their determination. Angela spoke of her own guilt at cutting contact when returning felt too painful. For their part, Nitan and Talutah offered neither accusation nor absolution, but something more valuable, honest perspective on their own journey from devastation to renewal. "When you all left," Nitan explained, his voice steady despite the emotional weight, "we had two choices: follow you into lives where we would be appendages, or build something meaningful where we stood." He spread his hands in a gesture that encompassed their home and land beyond. "We chose to build rather than diminish." "Not out of rejection," Talutah added, meeting each child's eyes in turn, "but because this place needed what we could give, needed us specifically, with our knowledge and memories." Outside, afternoon light softened the landscape, bringing depth to colors and gentleness to hard edges. Through the windows, they could see students arriving for the weekend workshop, Lisa's truck leading several cars up the drive. Young people emerging with notebooks and eager expressions. "Your students are here," Sarah observed. "Not students exactly," Talutah corrected. "Fellow learners." As Nitan excused himself to greet the arrivals, his children watched through the window, their father moving with purpose and dignity across land he had helped heal, welcomed by people who valued his knowledge. The image offered a different perspective on the man they had worried about abandoning to isolation. "He's teaching them," Angela realized aloud. "Both of you are, and learning from them," Talutah confirmed. "That's how knowledge stays alive." In this moment of recognition, their parents not as relics of the past, but as vital contributors to the future, something shifted in the family's understanding. Not complete resolution of all hurts and misunderstandings, but the beginning of a new perspective. A foundation for relationships rebuilt with greater honesty and respect. Like the land itself, family bonds could be restored when tended with patience and appropriate care. Different, perhaps, from their original form, but potentially stronger for having been broken and consciously mended. 1 year later, the ranch buzzed with activity. Truck doors slammed as families unloaded coolers and overnight bags. Children darted between adults, their excited voices carrying across the yard. A folding table near the barn groaned beneath potluck dishes, Sarah's famous enchiladas, James's carefully selected wines, Angela's artisanal bread, Miguel's grilled vegetables, harvested that morning. Nitan surveyed the gathering from the porch steps, marveling at how much had changed in a single year. After that initial reunion, the silence between visits had been broken. Sarah called weekly now. James and his wife had spent 2 long weekends helping expand the irrigation system. Most surprisingly, Miguel had purchased the vacant property adjoining theirs, commuting between his construction job in Albuquerque and weekends spent renovating the small house with his girlfriend Maria. "Quite a turnout," Ben Tahoma remarked, joining Nitan with a cup of coffee. The tribal elder had become a regular presence at the ranch, his knowledge complementing their own in the workshops that now operated monthly. "More than we expected," Nitan admitted. The occasion was dual purpose, the first anniversary of their workshops coinciding with Miguel's 33rd birthday. What had begun as a small family gathering had expanded to include Lisa and her students, neighbors who had become friends, and community members who participated in their educational programs. Across the yard, Talutah sat beneath the cottonwood tree, surrounded by children, 2 grandchildren, and several from neighboring families. Her hands moved with practiced grace as she demonstrated cornhusk doll making, her voice carrying just far enough for the children's circle to hear. Among the attentive faces was Emmem, Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, her dark eyes serious with concentration as she mimicked her grandmother's movements. The girl had shown immediate affinity for ranch life during her first visit, trailing Nitan through morning chores, asking endless questions about plants and animals, absorbing knowledge with uncanny intuition. Near the garden, Lisa conducted an impromptu tour for newcomers, explaining the integration of traditional methods with contemporary, sustainable practices. The big eyes have created something unique here, Nitan overheard her explaining. Not preservation of the past exactly, but evolution of knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The afternoon unfolded in the relaxed rhythm that had become characteristic of these gatherings. Shared food, intergenerational conversations, children exploring supervised freedoms impossible in urban settings. As evening approached, Miguel fired up the pit where a lamb had been slow cooking since dawn, and families arranged chairs in a loose circle for the meal. Talutah emerged from the house, carrying a wooden box Nitan hadn't seen before. Rectangular with a hinged lid, its surface decorated with painted symbols representing rain, corn, mountains, and stars, the essential elements of their desert life. "Before we eat," she announced, "I have something to share." Conversation quieted as she placed the box on a small table at the circle's center. Emma drifted to her side, instinctively sensing the moment's significance. "This past year has been about reconnection," Talutah began. "Not just of family, but of knowledge with practice, past with future." She opened the box, revealing neat compartments filled with labeled seed packets. "These are the seeds we've saved from our harvests, drought-resistant, adapted to this specific land through generations of selection." She removed a packet, holding it up so everyone could see the carefully handwritten label. "Lightning corn, descended from plants my grandmother grew, now strengthened by 2 years in our restored fields." One by one, she displayed different varieties: beans that fixed nitrogen in poor soil, squash that sprawled protectively over ground prone to rapid evaporation, herbs with medicinal properties forgotten by modern pharmacology. Each packet represented not merely food potential, but accumulated wisdom, the results of centuries of careful observation and adaptation. "Traditionally, seeds were wealth passed between generations," she explained. "Not money or property, but the ability to feed your family regardless of what came." She turned to Emma, who stood wide-eyed beside her. "Would you like to help me distribute these?" Together, grandmother and granddaughter moved around the circle, offering each family a selection of seed packets. Not merely gifts, but invitations to participate in continuing cycles of growth and harvest, connection and renewal. When they reached Miguel and Maria, Talutah added something extra, a small deerskin pouch containing starter for the blue corn ceremony bread, culture in its most literal form. "For your new home," she said simply. As darkness gathered, the celebration continued around the fire pit. Children dozed in parents' laps, while conversations ebbed and flowed, bridging differences of age and background through shared appreciation of food grown with integrity and prepared with care. Nitan found himself beside Angela, who had announced earlier that she was considering a sabbatical from her Seattle design firm to document traditional techniques for a book project. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, gesturing toward the gathered community. "When you decided to stay and rebuild?" Nitan considered the question seriously. "Not this specifically," he admitted. "We were just trying to honor what we knew, what we'd been taught." The rest followed naturally. Later, as guests departed with warm goodbyes and promises to return, family remained, their children and grandchildren now comfortable in spaces once abandoned. Sarah and her husband would stay the week, James until Monday. Angela had converted the old storage room into a studio for extended visits, and Miguel would return to his neighboring property after driving guests back to town. In the kitchen, Talutah found Emma sitting at the table, carefully examining the seed box that had been left open. "Grandma," the child asked, her small finger tracing the painted symbols on the lid, "will you teach me about these seeds?" "All of them." "Of course," Talutah answered, recognizing in her granddaughter's interest the most meaningful harvest of all, curiosity taking root in new generations. "That's why we save them. Outside, night had transformed the desert into a silver-shadowed landscape beneath an immense, star-filled sky. The same stars that had witnessed countless cycles of planting and harvest, departure and return, loss and renewal. The land itself seemed to exhale after the day's activities, settling into ancient rhythms that would continue long after individual lives had passed. Tomorrow would bring its own work, fields to tend, workshops to prepare, knowledge to transmit. But tonight, as Nitan and Talutah stood together on the porch of the home they had refused to abandon, they recognized in the quietness something their ancestors would have understood: the profound satisfaction of having cared well for what was entrusted to them, of leaving it stronger than they found it.